Hi there and welcome everybody. We are having our monthly behavioral support rounds and I wanted to welcome everyone here today to those rounds. I see people are still signing on, which is wonderful. We do have a packed agenda today with our amazing speaker, Sylvia Davidson. So we're going to jump right in to maximize the use of our time. I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Jordan Holland. I'm the Program Director for Behavior Supports in the Toronto region, and very, very pleased to be hosting, along with our panel members, the behavior support rounds for this month. They happen on the fourth Thursday of the month from 2 to 3 o'clock, so please hold that time in your calendars. We will be taking a break for December because of the holidays, but we will be resuming back in January. Just a reminder, Behavior Support Rounds is co-hosted by Toronto Central Behavior Supports Ontario, as well as the Ontario Centres for Learning, Research, Innovation in Long-Term Care. Really pleased to be working here together. Today, we're going to be talking about intimacy, dementia, and consent, and how these three components work together. Let's see if I can, there we go. Just wanting to start today's with a land acknowledgement. Although we are meeting here today virtually, we acknowledge that Baycrest and our related Toronto Central Behavior Support programs operate on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, which have cared for the land for thousands of years. We recognize that the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, and that this land remains home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and is subject to the Dish with One Spoon, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land today, and you may live and work in different territories, so we encourage you to reflect on the land on which you are located and consider your relationship to the land and to the people who are the traditional keepers of the land. Some housekeeping. Because this is a webinar, everyone's microphones are muted. If you would like to ask a question, please do feel free to put it in the chat, or there's also a Q&A option which goes directly to the panel presenters. You're also welcome to reach out to Agnes, who is our wonderful telemedicine coordinator, if you have any technical difficulties. This session is being recorded and will be available on both BSO and CLRI websites. And we're very, very happy to have Sylvia here today. We're going to have some time for Q&A. This topic usually gets a lot of questions and discussion going, so really excited about that. We will go through all the questions that are typed into the chat and the Q&A section first. And lastly, if you are interested in a certificate of attendance, then please complete. We have an evaluation that's emailed to those who are attending today. And please do fill out that evaluation and you will obtain your certificate of attendance. With that, I am going to turn it over to the inevitable Sylvia Davidson. I've worked with Sylvia for many years. She's the manager and professional practice chief for what we call the therapies, but the occupational therapy, physiotherapy, and therapeutic recreation at Baycrest. Throughout her career, she is an OT, of course, but she's worked clinically in all the different settings you can imagine and in lots of different clinical leadership roles, always in geriatrics, which is wonderful. She's particularly engaging and developed a lot of expertise around this area over many years. And I know she sits on the provincial sexuality and intimacy working group as part of BSO, which has just developed some wonderful resources I'm sure she'll be talking about as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sylvia for her presentation.
Thanks, Jordan. Hi, everyone. I am delighted to be here. I have to tell everyone that first, let's get some of my housekeeping out of the way. You can see an email contact on this first slide. You will have access to the slides afterwards. So I don't want people to get too hung up because some of my slides have quite a bit of content. They're a bit content heavy. I hope that we can make this as interactive as possible, even though it is Zoom. I myself do not have any conflicts or commercial interests that I need to disclose. They're not paying me to do this. And I love the fact that I don't have to be paid to do this. The program itself has not received financial support other than the generous support that we get from the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, no in-kind support, and no general program conflicts of interest that need to be disclosed. Also, sort of standard housekeeping slide around our sincere efforts to mitigate potential bias, to understand that the information that we share is based in the evidence as it is accepted within the profession. And I add my own sort of reflection here that much of what I'm going to share with you is based on my own work, my own clinical examples that others have shared with me. And those are my examples. I have my own biases. We all do. That's going to be one of the things that we're going to explore today, I hope. And you may have examples of your own that are more relevant for you. And I think it's important to respect that. You will know from registering today that there are certain objectives. My key objective out of this is that for those of you that might be feeling a little iffy about talking about sex, and trust me, if we were in a big room all together, I'd be walking around and really putting it in your face. I want people to get comfortable. I want us to be able to share examples that might make us feel a little bit perhaps upset, perhaps confused, and really start to recognize that there are a lot of common challenges when we talk about this issue. And I believe for those of you that are looking for a recipe, there is not one. This is a very case-by-case, individualized, customized approach that I'm going to present that has a bit of framework to it, because this tends to be on a continuum of responsive behaviors. My experience has taught me that it's the topic that makes people the most uncomfortable. It can create huge problems within a team, between the relationships that we have with an individual, with that individual's family. And I think that being able to step back, be a little bit objective, have a little bit of a systematic approach can really help to address that. Why do I think it's important? It's because we all have biases. Don't want to hear any of you say that, you know, the world is different and free love happened and the hippies changed the world, because my experience has taught me, and I've been doing this for a very long time, everyone reaches a point where this is no longer a comfortable topic. And it starts with the reason that we have sort of three sort of levels to the talk today is it starts right off the bat with just the fact that old people might still want to be intimate, that old people could still be sexual beings, that they might still want to have a relationship. And if COVID has taught us nothing else, it has confirmed for all of us that that need for connection is vital to our well-being. And I need everybody to keep that in your mind as I start to push the envelope a little bit, because I'm going to be blunt. Maybe it's not a bias around intimacy with aging. Maybe it's sexual orientation. If there's someone in the room who believes that homosexuality is a sin, the cases that I'm going to share are going to make you uncomfortable. We need to respect that. We need to understand within ourselves that we have values and beliefs that might influence how we react to a situation. We have to respect that everyone around the table is going to have a slightly different response to a situation, is going to have perhaps a different opinion, and every one of us is going to hit the wall. Some of us, it's simply at the fact that our parents have sex still, and for others, it's far off at the end of the continuum. We don't have time to explore all of that range, but I think it's important that we acknowledge that it's there, because that's where a lot of the problems come from, in my experience, when people start having to deal with a problem or a challenge. And I'm going to use air quotes a lot today because language is such a key component of this, and we really have to be able to talk about it. This is a brilliant example of us being able to at least start to open up this door to some conversation. Moving on from the first tier, just the fact that an older adult might still be a sexual being, we layer on dementia. And now we start to experience the range of behaviors that someone who has cognitive impairment may be demonstrating. And we understand that they are responsive behaviors, but I am here to tell you, if it is a behavior that is labeled as sexually inappropriate, there's my air quotes, we're going to have a challenge. And that's when we need to step back and be a little bit systematic in terms of how we approach this sexually inappropriate behavior. Then the third layer is consent. Far too often, I have people jump in and say, we cannot allow this to happen because they are impaired. And I'm here to tell you that's not necessarily the right approach, but it can really be pushing the envelope for people. So I hope we can just start to kind of explore stuff that I can use language that might make you uncomfortable and you won't leave the room. It's easier to leave the room when you're in a Zoom meeting though. I do understand that. I've talked about being systematic. I think we have to try and find a way to help ourselves get comfortable with this topic. Some of you may have heard me present on this topic before. I have presented on intimacy and aging and layered on dementia for BSL rounds in the past. So some of you, you know what I'm getting at when I say we need to understand our own issues. The next bullet I think is really important because I find that family members can end up being the most important part of the team, and yet so many times we see them as the enemy. And again, I'm putting it in air quotes. And any of you who see yourselves as perhaps a care provider right now, but also bridging the gap between being a professional or a formal care provider and a family member, I'm not trying to slam family members. I've been down this road as a family member myself. We need to involve families as partners in the discussion, not to be giving them that phone call when a pure and utter crisis has happened and we're calling them to tell them this horrible thing has happened and ask for them to say yay or nay. The police have been called because a family has said we want this individual charged with sexual assault. These are the things that happen when we don't take a step back and really examine how we're approaching something and what the behavior might actually mean. That, of course, leads me to my standard systematic approach to responsive behaviors generally. Always starting at the top with taking a breath, stopping and thinking. Most important when we're dealing with a behavior of a sexual nature, when we believe that someone is incompetent, incapable, vulnerable, and being taken advantage of. I am under no circumstances suggesting that those situations don't arise. Of course they do, but we need to be able to look at the full picture and figure out exactly where do we need to intervene. Responsive behaviors generally, as we know, are a complicated process. If we truly believe that they are responsive, in other words, the person is responding to something going on around them, we need to really understand what's going on around them, and we need to understand that person. What I often do is try and separate out a couple of early steps. One is objectively examining the problem. And this is a general approach to responsive behaviors. The thing that's always sort of mystified me is why most of us will embrace this kind of an approach to understanding a responsive behavior. But as soon as it's a sexual behavior, this all goes out the window and we get emotional and we jump in. And I'm saying, let's stop, let's step back, and let's look at whether this could indeed be viewed exactly the same way we would view any other responsive behavior. Because I know many of you, I know the work you do. I know the challenges that you face on a daily basis. And I know that many of you, you just naturally live and breathe this approach. And somehow just the idea that it's intimacy, that it's sex, that it's wrong, just we lose our rational brain. And I'm here to say, let's take a step back and get our common sense back on. Being objective about examining the problem is just as vital when it's a sexual behavior as when it's any other behavior. Because even if it's someone who's constantly yelling at the top of their voice and everybody's just losing their mind with the noise, and you call in your BSO person, or you call in your psychogeriatric resource consultant, or you call in, I don't know, the social worker from your unit, and you say, you got to fix this. And they start with some standard questions, which of course you don't want to hear. You just want them to fix the problem. And one of the questions often is, well, when does it happen? And the standard answer is all the time. And I get that, because when they're screaming at the top of their lungs and you can't think, it feels like they haven't stopped for an entire day. But we know if you step back, that's not true. So being able to objectively examine the problem is really important. I'm not going to insist that you use a particular tool. Use what you're using in your current setting. Use a simple ABC chart if you're alone going into a house in the community and you don't feel you have like the system long-term care home support behind you. The objective examination just means looking at what is it specifically that I'm looking at. That's the behavior, the B in an ABC template. What triggered the behavior? What was the antecedent? That's the A. And what was the consequence of the behavior? The C. That is an important step to try and help us be objective. The other thing that is important, and it sometimes isn't able to be done until after the fact, is giving yourself some time to step back and examine your own feelings, your own response to the behavior, not to be critical of yourself, but for learning. And then the middle of this very busy slide is the standard understanding of everything that might be going on with the person, everything that might be going on within the environment. And if you've been called in to help a team and you've got 4 people on shift this day when you come in, and all 4 of them are working with this resident, and all 4 of them are sitting around the table with you, let all 4 of them try and answer some of these questions. Why do you think this is happening? And you might get 4 different answers to that question. And staff get very frustrated because they just want one answer to the question because that's the problem and that's how we're going to fix it. I would choose to say, you get 4 different answers, that's great. You got 4 different people, 4 different relationships, 4 different actions, 4 people who've had slightly different observations. So one of them might have seen a very physical issue with the individual. Someone else might have had a much different sense of the person's psychological status. Somebody else is just really stuck on the fact that it's cognition. And the 4th person is considering the environment. They don't think there's anything wrong with the person at all. It's all about the environment. That means you've got 4 possible strategies to try. Each time you try a strategy, it allows you to see whether something might change, might get better, might improve, might not get better. Behavior might remain. Don't be afraid to work through this exercise. People don't want to work through this exercise because they figure if the behavior stays, they've failed. No. It just means we have to try something else now. And this constant cycle of reassessing, going back and starting again. Okay, so maybe it wasn't physical. Maybe it really is something going on in the environment. It's such an important approach that helps take some of the emotion out of it. Let me give you an example for a case. Here's an example. Mr. Smith, he's in the resident lounge, sitting in a corner all by himself. The others in the room are involved in a card game a little bit off from where Mr. Smith is sitting. Then Mr. Smith begins to masturbate, and the other residents notice this and they become upset. And I'll just share something with you, completely inappropriate, but I will tell you, I was having this conversation with staff a few years ago, pre-COVID, when you could walk in and meet with staff, and there were 2 staff in the room as we were talking about this case who were in the corner having some kind of weird conversation with each other. And I kind of felt that I had to figure out what was wrong. And it turned out they didn't know what the heck masturbation meant. They knew what he was doing, but they did not know the word. Again, I say language is so important. We have to try and find a way to have a conversation so that people don't feel stupid, so that they're willing to talk about the answers to my questions. And you'll see that I have similar questions for each of the cases that I'm presenting. What are your thoughts about this example? How would you handle it? How would it make you feel? Again, I think people need to be able to have the safety to talk about how very uncomfortable what they've just observed made them feel. And that discussion then helps you get to a point where staff want you to get to, which is what should they do? And once you've done that, you've had them talk about it. And then whatever the system is that you use, you want to go back to that systematic approach and start to examine, okay, so this is how you felt when it happened. We're not really sure exactly what might be going on. Let's think about some of the factors that might be leading to this particular behavior. Is it a physical? Is there some sort of physical discomfort? Is it psychological? For example, is this who this person is? And this is where you need your family because who really knows this person? Maybe one of your team members knows this person very well. Maybe we need the family involved in this conversation. And I know nobody wants to bring the family in when it's their grandpa who's been masturbating in the lounge, but in order to truly do the best we can to understand the behavior, we need to understand this person. Is it cognitive? Is it indeed a loss of inhibition that this person needed to masturbate and didn't realize that it was anything wrong with it? And then the environmental component, too many times we really do need to think about this. And are we precipitating this? Are we inadvertently reinforcing the behavior? Very important discussion that sometimes is not easy to have, because again, staff think they're the problem. They think they did something to make it happen. How many of you have ever been giving personal care to somebody and they suddenly start to get an erection, or a woman starts to moan like she's in pleasure, and immediately staff, they drop the washcloth, they're jumping back. It's like, what have I done? We have to stop having that kind of a reaction. Stop and think about what's happening. You have gone in, you've got the person naked, you're touching them in a place that maybe nobody's touched them in a very long time. So is this just a physiological response to what you're doing? Because that by itself is what some of you need to be reassured by. You haven't done anything wrong. We can talk a little bit about how you might handle that kind of a situation if it's making you uncomfortable. But I think first we have to be able to talk about it. So let's use Mr. Smith as our example of this systematic approach. You have to talk about what the challenges might be. And again, remember I said you got 4 people. They've each given you a different reason for what they think might be wrong. One of them says, Mr. Smith is really uncomfortable. The second one says, no, you know what? He did this all the time. His kids don't even want to have anything to do with him because he was like a dirty old man. And you might actually get somebody to use that kind of language. Somebody else says, you know what? He didn't used to be like this, but he's been with us for a long time and he's deteriorating cognitively. And I think he's losing his sense of what's socially appropriate. Pure brain damage at a neurological level. And again, I remind many of you, when we think about brain damage and we think about a stroke, you can see somebody walking down the hall past you in the nursing station and you know that they've had a stroke. How do you know? Because their arm is in a sling, they're in a contracture. They have a certain way of limping when they walk. There are obvious physical manifestations of the brain damage. Even after all these years of studying dementia, I still find that there are people who don't seem to make the connection with that diagnosis and brain damage, because on so many levels, the person still seems very intact, very appropriate, very sweet when they go in and greet him. And so it's like, no, he's just a dirty old man. And then the last strategy, looking at the environment. You've got 4 people. I guarantee you, each one of those staff might do something completely different when they are called in to fix the problem of Mr. Smith, who is actively masturbating in front of them when they go into the lounge. So you got 4 different challenges. That's okay. Each one is going to come with a different strategy. So maybe if it is discomfort, we need to examine whether there's a physical issue that can be treated. I will tell you a lot of times, and here, sidebar, yes, we're talking about an individual who's an older adult. Now we're layering on some physical issues. Now we're going to assume that they have some cognitive problems as well. So indeed, maybe this person is itchy. When was the last time they had a good wash and everything down there got aired out? And you can't see me, but I'm putting my hand down there. And if we were together in the room, I would do that because that's what grosses people out. But he's itchy. So maybe he just started scratching and the next thing you know, he revealed himself. Why is he itchy? Does he have a rash? Does he have a urinary tract infection? There are a lot of physical things that could result in someone poking themselves in their nether regions. And if we treat it, it might solve the problem. And in fact, he just might not have the cognitive ability to know that if he's going to do that in public, he's going to get himself in trouble. Another thing, maybe it's his previous personality. So we need to understand that, you know, was mom always a flirt? Has dad always been a bit of a ladies' man? These are the kind of conversations that you need to have with your families, that your families need to be involved in as partners in the discussion. And I am not pretending it's easy. Trust me, I know it is not easy to have these conversations. I remember the day we got the call from the retirement home about my father-in-law, who was an extremely cognitively impaired gentleman, but still looked pretty good, presented pretty well socially, and was one of very few men on his unit, and the ladies loved him. And he loved the attention, and he struck up a relationship with a woman, and she was very impaired and would tell the same story a million times a day. And Harry, God bless him, couldn't remember anything anybody told him, and he could listen to those stories a million times a day, and they were the perfect partner. And they found each other, and they started to have a relationship together, and we got the call. And so I get where some of you are coming from when you go, but we can't do this. You know, the families are going to freak out, because some of my family did freak out about this. We got to a point where everybody understood what was best for my father-in-law, though. Let me jump to another one. Is it indeed a cognitive issue? Because we have to put cognition into this, because we have to talk about consent. So generally, if, for example, this is what Mr. Smith is doing, and somebody has slapped his hand and told him it's dirty and he has to stop, and somebody else has shouted at him and said, "Oh, Mr. Smith, that's disgusting. Look how embarrassed everybody is." He's not even going to understand any of that. It's like my brushing your teeth approach. You know, you go in, wake somebody up in the morning, you get them up, and I've seen family members do it with a loved one when they're the primary care provider at home. I've seen staff do it in a nursing home. You go in, open up the windows, you in your loud, cheery voice, and I'm the first one to say, I got that annoying, loud, cheery voice. Oh yeah. And good morning, get up. You know what? Just go in there and brush your teeth. And as soon as you come out, I'll help you get dressed and we'll go have breakfast. And I leave the room because I got a million other things to do. And I turn around and Mama's right behind me. And she's not dressed and she hasn't brushed her teeth. But when I stop and think about everything I just told her, it was way too much information. It wasn't communicated clearly. And in all honesty, the last thing I said was breakfast, and that's why she followed me out of the room, because she's hungry. We mustn't judge. We have to try and step back from that instinctive emotional response to this kind of a behavior. And that leads us into the discussion around the fourth challenge, which is looking within the environment. And I'm calling us as the social environment a key player here, because we all have to be involved in this discussion. We all have to share our thoughts about what might be going on. And we all have to try and be consistent in the approach. Because if one of us giggles at Mr. Smith and walks away, and somebody else smacks his hand, we are not helping him understand what he's done and why behaviors are being responded to in that way. And if we could be consistent, those of you that do this job well, you know that consistency can really be beneficial for our patients and our clients and our residents and our loved ones, because it's the inconsistent messaging from everybody who's coming past them that leads them to go, I have no idea what's going on. And they were a bit confused about what was going on in the first place. So I jump back to this again as a template that I think we really need to try and keep in our back pocket, because the lines of communication must stay open. We have to keep talking about this. Also, I want to throw in a little wrench into this example before I move on. I want to give us a couple more examples, and then I'm going to try and stop talking so that we can engage in some discussion ourselves. But let me ask you, for those of you that are going, yeah, whatever, what if I changed the case simply to say that Mr. Smith is in the lounge, he's in a corner by himself, the others are involved in a card game, and suddenly Mr. Smith begins to sing in a loud voice. The other residents notice and become upset. If I took out masturbation and put singing in a loud voice in, you don't have to answer, but think to yourself, would it make a difference? Would it make difference? Would it make a difference with some of the staff that I work with? Would they feel differently if it wasn't a sexual behavior? Because I honestly do think sometimes it does make a difference. We cannot pretend that these behaviors that have a sexual connotation don't just foster a completely different reaction in us. And that's why it's so important that we talk about it. And in a couple of my later slides, I'm gonna do a bit more than say we just need to talk about it, because I firmly believe that as an organizational level, at an institutional level, the individual at the bedside doesn't get the support that they need, because oftentimes you're kind of on your own to deal with this, and you would never dream of talking about how you feel when something like this happens, that the guy gets an erection when you're giving him care, or that the woman, I mean, I've had people shocked to know that an old lady could have an orgasm when they're giving her care. Well, you know, if you're rubbing her down there and she used to get orgasms, you might be promoting that. And just to throw it out there, if it's freaking you out, you could just try maybe giving them the washcloth and letting them finish it. Because again, maybe that is your personal wall. Maybe you hit the wall there. And some of you are already going, oh, but I can't let them do that because they won't get the job done properly. Okay, we need to talk about that. But how do we balance my absolute inability to continue to provide care to this person if I have to do all of that task, versus letting them finish the task of cleaning themselves. I just throw it out there as a topic for discussion. Okay, so more things to discuss. Let me make this a little more complicated. So this is not Mr. Smith sitting masturbating in the corner. This is Mr. Apple and Mr. Pear. Mr. Apple and Mr. Pear are both residents with dementia on the same unit, your unit, in a long-term care facility. Mr. Apple is a homosexual. He has a partner. This was all made clear when he was admitted. Nobody pretended that his sexual orientation was not what it was. And his partner, who is a younger man, rarely visits. Mr. Pear is a widow and has 2 grown sons. And really, the sons are not involved in Mr. Pear's care or his life in the facility. Some of staff have never met the kids. So here we have now, Mr. Apple and Mr. Pear have been observed holding hands, hugging. They've even been seen kissing. And I'm kind of shortening the scenario, but a little bit of the backstory, because this is one of the cases that I was asked to come in and help fix the problem, Sylvia, a few years ago. It turned out that staff had sought some involvement from family, and Mr. Apple's partner, the younger man, acknowledged that Mr. Apple was lonely, and he didn't feel that Mr. Apple was the same person to him anymore, but he recognized his loneliness, and he was fine with any relationship that Mr. Apple might develop in the facility. Mr. Pear, who had been married, his wife had passed, he has the sons. Turns out from talking to somebody, and I was never clear who, Mr. Pear had homosexual relationships in the past. What we'd learned was that in fact is what had led to initially his separation from his wife and then their subsequent divorce. And that was why the sons were not that involved in his care, because when he came out to the family, they abandoned him. And so staff aren't really sure about what the son's level of awareness is of all of this, but there's your situation. Again, a systematic approach, if you're being asked to address this with the team, if you're being asked to help people fix the problem, you've got to find out, what do people think about this? How would they handle it? How is this situation going to make you feel? And I have to tell you, at the time that I was brought in, we had already jumped to the answer to the second question, because how would you handle the situation was fully explained to me. They talked to the family. The kids weren't involved with Mr. Pear. Mr. Apple's partner said they were fine. So they'd agreed, a couple of the staff had agreed that nobody was hurting anybody. They seemed to both be enjoying each other's company. Nobody liked to see them being intimate in public. So if they seemed to be coming together and starting to show affection for each other, they would be redirected into one of the gentlemen's rooms and the door would be closed. And I was brought in to fix the problem being 2 staff knew what was going on behind the door and they didn't approve. So that's why this now opens up a whole can of worms. And how would this situation make you feel? What are your thoughts? These are really important points for discussion with the team on this one, but it's not going to be easy, because here's where you have to actually try and unpack whether someone truly believes that homosexuality is a sin and they cannot abide what seems to be supported or approved in their workplace. I'm not saying there's an answer here. I'm saying that until you unpack and explore these questions, you can't know how to move on and help staff with the last question, which is, what are we going to do? I will say that the facility itself had tried really hard to respect the rights of these 2 men. And indeed, most of the work that I ended up doing in some repeat visits to the home was working with the staff who were really uncomfortable with what was being allowed to happen. And I think that overall, I'm not going to say that it was the most successful intervention that I've ever been involved in, but we came to a point where I think staff were at least willing to understand that just because I believe it's wrong doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong for them. And starting to weigh the risks and the benefits of allowing a relationship like this to continue versus forcibly separating 2 people who genuinely want to be together. But again, I'm not solving your problem. Let me give you another example. So we've talked about aging and intimacy. We've talked about maybe some more straightforward demonstrations of sexually inappropriate behavior. We've thrown the wrench of sexual orientation into the mix. Now let's really get at consent and capacity, because this is where, honestly, you can lose your mind. Mrs. Purple. So Mrs. Purple is in your facility. She has severe dementia. Mr. Purple visits his wife regularly and frequently asks for privacy. Staff have accidentally entered Mrs. Purple's room when Mr. Purple is visiting and have found them both engaged in sexual intercourse. In other words, both in bed, him on top of her. The concern is somebody, after this has been going on for a while, has really tentatively raised the fear that maybe Mrs. Purple appears to be resisting. So this is a whole new layer of risk and capacity, and how we protect someone who's vulnerable becomes a huge issue. But you'll see that I've started with the same general questions. What are your thoughts? How are you going to handle this? How is this going to make you feel? Again, starting with that discussion, because right off the bat, you're going to learn as people start to talk about how they feel. For some people in the discussion, their husband and wife, it's none of my business. And I've had staff clearly tell me that. For other people, it's like, well, don't go into the room if it bothers when you see them together. So you know that it's really hard to have privacy in a long-term care facility, right? I can remember going into a home one day to give a talk on something, I don't know, feeding or nutrition or something, nothing to do with intimacy. And staff were all in a mess on this unit. And so we just had to completely pivot because they were all upset because a gentleman had come in. And this is not Mrs. Purple's case, but I use it as a slightly maybe less upsetting example of where we foster these problems, because this gentleman had come in to visit his wife and he pulled the personal support worker aside as he was about to leave just to let her know. And then the people knew him. This was fine. This was a good family. But he pulled her aside to let her know that next week was their anniversary and he was planning to come in and he was going to be bringing a special meal for her. And he was hoping that they would be able to be intimate. I don't believe that's the language he used, but that's the language I will use. And so he needed them to know that he needed the door to be closed and locked. And I can't tell you the stimulating conversation that I had with the team this day, because it turns out, A, they can't lock the doors in these rooms. Some of you probably work in facilities like this, where for safety reasons, you can't lock the doors. And this staff person had actually tried to explain that to this gentleman, and he said he would pull the furniture across and block the door from inside if they wouldn't give him her privacy. And I mean, it just led to, in fact, the conversation ended up having nothing to do with a married couple maybe being intimate, but everything to do with how these problems develop, because it turns out that some staff didn't understand why the door needed to be kept locked. And because we'll just knock before we go in. And I've watched many people, I think I've even been guilty of myself. You're kind of knocking and opening the door before you even wait for somebody to say, come in. So there was just, and the fire marshal was called, because if we do lock these doors, what if people, I mean, it was amazing where we went with this. Let me come back to this case, because the issue of Mrs. Purple appearing to resist is a critical component of an examination of capacity. When people say to me, well, you know what, she's cognitively impaired, so we can't allow this. And it's kind of like, well, are you sure? You know, when you talk to somebody else, they say that they really seem to enjoy the interaction. And we're not talking about sexual intercourse. I'm talking about two people who seek each other out randomly at some point in the day and sit together, maybe hold hands. Staff just hate to see that, because it's a slippery slope and who knows what might happen. And they don't seem to be avoiding it. They don't seem or appear to be resisting. And when I explore that with them, it's like, well, how can they? They're impaired. And I'll usually bring it back to, well, hang on a minute. Are there other times that you're working with this person or providing care, for example, when you try to do something that they don't want? And of course, the answer is always, well, sure. And how do you know they don't want it? And then you hear about the kind of behavior, you know, you get somebody semi-naked, stick them on a commode chair with a big empty hole in the middle, put their bare bottom on that hole, and then drag them backwards down the hall. Because have you ever noticed how commodes simply won't go forwards once you put a weight in it? Drag them backwards down the hall to a shower room. 9 times out of 10, they will tell you they don't want to do it. They might not say, please don't do this to me, it's not dignified, but they might scratch, they might yell, they might cry, and you've then set them up for a bad day. We have a way, if we take the time to try and understand the person, to understand how they might be responding to a situation. And I think we always have to come back and try and explore that. In the case of Mrs. Purple, the staff person that had observed this more than once, indeed, you know, when we explored it further and we talked to Mr. Purple, she was resisting. He was a demanding spouse. She was his wife, and he thought it was his right. And he didn't care whether she liked it or not. And I'm just being blunt with you guys, because that's the kind of situation where you need your whole team, you need your director of care, you need the social worker, you need people involved to sit down with this family and really help Mr. Purple understand that maybe what he's doing is not appropriate. So that leads me to some of these key questions, because there's going to be risk. If we're going to talk about this, we're going to have to talk about risk and what the level of risk is. And if there are risks, are there benefits? And once again, while we're talking about, well, yeah, you know what? I mean, maybe some of the staff don't like to see two men holding hands, but if we separate them, they both get really agitated and then everybody has a bad day. I mean, that kind of a conversation can really help people understand balancing the risk against the alternatives, but we can't ignore the fact that still we have to think about if the fact that it's two men. I guarantee you some people will have a problem with two men holding hands, but not two women, because two women, it's cute. Two men, it's not. So we have to be able to talk about that. At an organizational level, we do not have policies to support staff, and that's a problem because staff need support. They need to understand that there is much going on that makes it not just a simple sexually inappropriate behavior, but there are layers and layers of things that we must understand. And that has to start with us being able to talk, which means in the answer to the question, what else do we need? Oh man, we need a safe space. We need an opportunity, first off. I mean, the fact that you guys have been allowed to attend today, you've got the time to think about this. Maybe you don't care what it is that I'm saying, but maybe my cases are prompting some reflection of your own. That's vital to you becoming even better at doing the job you already do. And if we have to talk about it, you need to feel that it's a safe environment to talk about it, because you can't say something that reveals how you actually feel and then have everybody dismiss you or laugh at you or say, well, you're just a prude or that's ridiculous. Because I've seen that happen too many times. It destroys the team. It does not do any good for care of the resident. And ultimately, then the resident is going to suffer. One of the first questions to ask yourself, if you're asked to fix a problem, is to really try and figure out, first off, who this is a problem for. The team that says put a sock on the doorknob so we know what's going on inside the room says they fixed the problem, and somebody else is disgusted because of the sock on the door. So is the problem what's going on behind closed doors? Or is the problem the way this team has figured out how to flag don't go into the room? Give the person some privacy. That's a really important starting point. If there are indeed behaviors, where are they coming from? Going back to that systematic approach, that crowded slide. So many factors might be contributing to what we're seeing. And always stop and ask, are my clients' needs, is the quality of life of the person I'm responsible for being limited by my beliefs and values? Because if you ask yourself that honestly and the answer is yes, then you have some soul searching to do. I want to stop because we're running out of time already. I have thrown out several different references, and as Jordan said, there's so much more work happening right now around this topic. It's actually really exciting for me. When I first started exploring education around intimacy and dementia, if I ever went online, all I found was ads for Viagra. And now I find there's a whole lot more content. You can find policies, you can find references to research that's being done. And even if you are keen to look at your own sort of evidence-based fundamentals, maybe you've got families who just want some real lay terms. Go to your local Alzheimer's Society chapter. The Alzheimer's Society, this is like a typical understanding document. They do all these conversations about, they've created a conversation about dementia, intimacy, and sexuality. And it's written in a language that people will understand. You could share it with families. It might be a good starting point, because you have to be able to open the door to these conversations. Having said we want to open the door to the conversations, I think I need to stop talking, and I'm going to let Jordan decide what we do next. I don't know if I should just stop sharing. Do we have some questions? What should we do? I hope we have questions.
Sylvia, I know there's lots of questions. The first question was just, can we have access to the recording? Of course you can. This is being recorded. It will be posted on both BSO and CLRI websites. But if you email Agnes or Tanya or I, we're also happy to send you the recording as soon as we have it. Can everyone take just a moment? We'll give you a moment because you've been absorbing all of Sylvia's amazing information, to put your questions into the chat box or the Q&A box, and we're happy to read them out loud and discuss them as a group.
And I apologize because I know I quickly went over some content. It's just that I kind of wanted to get to this point, but if you have the recording, you'll be able to go back to the slides. And as Jordan said right at the beginning, guys, if questions come to you afterwards, send them in, and you know, if it's appropriate that I get, you know, consulted to answer some questions after the fact, I'm more than happy to do that. It's a lot to take in 1 hour. Jordan, I think I've told you that before.
Yes, of course. Okay, we have a question here. So Callie asks, in the context of a resident or an individual with severe cognitive impairment, they're in a room with their loved one. I guess this is a caregiver, family member, or a partner. Do you gauge any potential risks? So how do you gauge risk? Example, if the resident is not reciprocating or resisting, or if no staff are checking in an effort to maintain privacy, in an effort to maintain privacy. So I think people are just, as you're saying, Sylvia, like struggling with like, how much do I actively try to assess risk versus assuming some level of consent unless I see otherwise. I think there's some people grappling with how do I really realistically and practically support intimacy while still maintaining safety.
Okay, and so the first thing is, if we had another hour, we could explore this. The second thing is, I sometimes joke about having stenciled across my forehead, it depends, because I'm already sort of asking myself all kinds of questions. So this is like a husband and wife who are jointly in a room, for example. And I mean, it may be that you've kind of collapsed a few different scenarios to raise the question. You know, couples do indeed move into long-term care together. That's fine. Are they allowed to be intimate? Sure. Profound cognitive impairment always does raise a question about consent. Of course it does. But I wouldn't want to think that everyone immediately is going to jump in to protect one of these individuals because of the cognitive impairment, and therefore there is risk. I think that's where I found that sometimes we create problems for ourselves by jumping in and just assuming because the person's impaired, they cannot give consent. And so I would want to have a bit of a conversation around what is it that you're observing that concerns you, because there might indeed be some examples of how the person is responding. I mean, for example, I can think of a woman whose husband came to pick her up every weekend and took her home. And it took a long time for staff to start being concerned, because when she came back, she was different. And they felt she couldn't really tell them, but she seemed different. Then it got to the point where she didn't seem to welcome him coming in on Friday and taking her out on the weekend. And then somebody saw bruising. And, you know, a lot of investigating ended up that indeed the gentleman was taking her home so that they could have an intimate relationship on the weekend. And then he brought her back to the home during the week. And she was not consenting. And she would try and fight him, but he felt it was his right. This goes on far more than we realize. I've had lots of stories from people who, you know, a wife who thinks her husband is now much more sexually sort of aggressive in her terms than he used to be, partly because of his lack of inhibition or his disinhibition, but also, you know, as we explored it, because he was no longer getting the kind of social connection that he used to have. She felt he wasn't really her husband. She didn't feel like he was his wife. He would demand sex from her and she would put up with it because she thought she had to. There's so many layers here. If indeed you know the individual well enough to be able to see signs of the person not consenting. So, and I can't tell you what it's going to look like, because not everyone can say no. But sometimes one of the parties can say no. And then we have to start to explore what that means, because I remember working with someone who was aphasic in addition to having dementia, and no was his word of choice for everything. So no didn't mean no. No was how he talked. So, and again, and this is why I'm saying it depends. It can get very complicated. But I think that we all have an obligation, if we're starting to feel, I mean, the staff with the woman who was going out with her husband on the weekend, most of them blamed themselves horribly for what they felt had been going on for a long time, because it wasn't until she showed physical evidence of bruising that they really started to value their gut feelings that they'd had earlier. If you've got a gut feeling, I always say go with your gut. I don't mean call the police, but I mean go with your gut and start to explore this. Talk to somebody else. Have they been seeing the same thing? You know, does anybody else have any thoughts about what's happening? Do other people know this resident better than you? Would they have a better idea of what she's like when she or he resists? Because that's what we have to start with. And I mean, I'm not saying that's going to be an easy conversation, but sometimes it is indeed a conversation about a marital relationship and how someone who still has needs might have those needs met in an alternate way from forcing themselves on their partner, because that's sometimes what it boils down to. And no, I'm not saying it's an easy conversation to have, but maybe that husband or that wife needs to have a supportive conversation around they still have needs. And unfortunately, your relationship has changed and your husband or your wife, you know, they're not the same anymore. Their needs are not the same anymore. They need your companionship. You know, the 50 years that you were together means something to them. But maybe your need for sexual gratification needs to be managed a different way. And sometimes you have that conversation and you come up with strategies, and maybe somebody has to learn to masturbate because that's how they're going to get their sexual release. I just need the release. We had it every week. I'm not giving it up. You can't have it with her. Maybe there's another way we can handle this. And I mean, I've gone down a rabbit hole here. I might have gone down a hole that nobody wanted to go. And sorry about the choice of words, just their language. Oh my goodness. But part of the reason that it's such a complicated and muddled answer is because it's not a straightforward question. In my mind, thinking about the various ways that we've come at it. Please don't just assume because someone is impaired that they're incapable of understanding companionship, having a need for intimacy, maybe at a very superficial level, and supporting that. Stop talking, Sylvia.
Sylvia, it's wonderful. These are very complicated, complex issues. We have 3 questions in the Q&A chat. I'm going to go with Alma, just because some of the other folks, we have their contacts and we can get back to them. Okay. Alma asks, how can long-term care homes incorporate intimacy and sexuality into a more regular discussion or consider it more often?
Okay, I love that question. It depends. Right off the bat, I will tell you something. When we admit someone to long-term care, in addition to all the questions we ask to get this person settled in our home, do we ever explore some of the more intimacy related aspects? Do they still have a partner? Were they intimate before? What kind of a relationship did they have? What kind of a bed did they sleep in? If you take someone, and I know you guys have heard this before because I use it as such a classic example. You take someone who is now impaired to the level that they're moving into the nursing home. For the last 60 years, they have slept in the same bed beside a warm, kicking, snoring, farting, breathing body. And we've suddenly ripped them out of that relationship and put them in a bed alone. This is why that individual now, once they kind of get settled in the home, they get up in the middle of the night, they wander around and they crawl into somebody else's bed. They're not a sexual predator necessarily, but we haven't explored what they were used to. I mean, we want to know what their favorite food is. We might actually ask intimate questions. If you have an occupational therapist in your home, good job. The OT will be asking, really detailed questions about toileting, for example. Well, if you're going to ask toileting, can they wipe themselves? Are they continent? If you're going to ask questions like that, maybe you should ask a few questions about sexual expression as well. Because if dad was always a ladies' man, we need to know that. Because that means once he starts moving around the unit, he is going to be a ladies' man. And the ladies love a ladies' man. And if mom was always a bit of a flirt, I'm sorry, it's not an easy conversation to have. But do you see how we need to know that so that once the person joins us, we have a better understanding of how we might be able to meet their needs? You need policies that help us understand. And people always go to the Residence Bill of Rights, and the Residence Bill of Rights is indeed a good document to talk about. They have the right, to have visitors, and it doesn't actually say they can be sexually intimate with those visitors, but some homes have kind of expanded on that. It's really difficult to start to develop policy in a home because right off the bat, what are you going to call it? And even the label that you give to it, you're going to call it a policy around sexual intimacy. You're going to call it just intimacy. What does intimacy mean? Intimacy doesn't necessarily mean sexual intercourse. It could just mean the need for companionship. Everybody knows people need companionship. And again, we've learned through COVID that isolating people is not good for them in any way, shape, or form. But in order to get your home to really foster this, I would say use your BSO teams, use your educators, ask them to come in and facilitate some conversations. And if you've got somebody who's been, causing problems, use that as a starting point for a discussion. Don't be surprised if it doesn't go really well the first couple of times, because this is not an easy conversation to have. But if staff start to learn that they can have a conversation, talk a little bit about their feelings without feeling that they're going to be punished for it, it's going to start to change the culture. And that's what we need. We need a culture change. And every single one of you who's here is part of that culture change. You're here, you already know this. I feel like I'm preaching to the converted, and I say, get out there and don't be afraid to ask, what do you think about that? How do you feel when that happens? Maybe you've never asked that of your coworker. Maybe you should, because maybe they just feel guilty. They just feel that they're the reason this person is doing this disgusting behavior and they don't know what to do about it. And it can't be easy to start that discussion. But if you go back and start having these conversations, you might be amazed at how the culture starts to change.
And with that amazing note, Sylvia, we want to thank you so much for presenting to us today. We had a lot of engagement. There's a couple more questions I'm going to email you separately with the people who have asked them. Folks, I put the email addresses for BSO and CLRI in the email. If you have more questions, feel free to reach out to us. This will all be shareable for you, for others who couldn't join. But I want to thank Sylvia so much for her time. Sylvia is, I hope I can say, going to be retiring from Baycrest in the next little while. And so I begged her most fervently to present before she left, so we could actually record her genius. And I know Sylvia is open to still being connected to this community even after retirement. So I just wanted to thank you for your passion and your expertise that you've developed and that you so generously share with all of us. Thank you. And thanks to all of you who have spent the last hour with us. Reach out if you need anything, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, all of you out there.